understanding that I'm going to convey in a minute was very influenced by having a year ago facilitated a private meeting of US and Chinese security and military officials, which didn't go very well. This was a group of people who had all spent their time in each other's countries. Most of them spoke both languages. The human connections were very warm. And yet, by the end of the week, they could agree only that collaboration between their two countries was not feasible.
For me, the question for policymakers is, where is the new diplomacy structures being built? Not just the what, but where. And there are going to be some locations which are fraught in still maintaining 19th century theories as a means of governance. So they'll be rooted in war game theories. But there'll be some locations which are going to chart a pathway for a new form of planetary transnational governance to be emerging from, not object-orientated, but be an emergent function from.
If you start to have that internal shift, even as a policymaker, you become part of the agency of the transformation from within, rather than feeling frustrated constantly, that as if you're hitting against the boundary of the systems that is giving you a job and a payroll.
Security is becoming indivisible in its entanglement with planetary and living systems. For mutually assured security to emerge, we should invest in preemptive peace strikes. Policymakers and diplomats are in a double bind as agents of destruction and agents of transformation, sensing the cracks in the systems and themselves.
Hello, and thank you for joining us in this discussion about an important concept called mutually assured security and how we can use this concept in our relationship with China. We will do this with our guest speakers. A quick introduction. First, there's Indy Johar. He's professor at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia and founder of the Dark Matter Labs in London. Warm welcome to you. Then there's Anneloes Smitsman, originally from the Netherlands, but residing in Mauritius. And she's the founder of and CEO of Earthwise Ventures, and a futurist and scientist who focuses on sustainability issues and systems change. Warm welcome to you as well. And then last but not least, there's Adam Kahane. Mr. Kahane is specialized in conflict resolution, so disentangling complex issues, one might say. In fact, he's done so in more than 50 countries. I'd like to ask the first question to Mr. Johar, if I may. When we talk about this mutually assured security, what exactly are we talking about?
Firstly, I think what I would start with, and I think you've covered this in some of your previous calls and previous sort of videos, is that security dynamics are now outstripping market and commodity dynamics. And what we're seeing as we move, as you rightly say, as we move past peak materials and greater volatility in global supply chains, what we're seeing is that actually security takes precedence over market commodity value. And in that worldview, and you could argue this is a situation that's going to accelerate, both as a function of globally accelerated volatility in terms of climate breakdown and other forms of social breakdown, but also as we go through peak material lenses, these pressures will accelerate. The strategic response that we're seeing, or the initial response that we're seeing, is what I would call is a bounded theory of security. So what you start to say is, well, one, the expansion of security domains. So security is no longer about kinetic security. It's about energy, food, water, minerals. It's the expanded boundary of security. And then our ability to deal with that security through bounded national boundaries, insufficient, critical alliances, second order response. And third, which I would argue is an entangled theory of security, which recognizes that our security is non-divisible for third parties. I'll give you a classic example. I would say that the Greenland ice shelf melting is basically a non-divisible. We cannot divide the UK, China, India cannot divide itself from the impacts of the Greenland ice shelf melting, which would increase water sea levels by so I think nearly hundreds of meters, if not more. So when you start to look at it from that sense, what you find is that there are pathways to mutually assured destruction. Now, the scope of our pathways to mutually assured destruction are massively accelerating. So what you start to realize is that there is a system level dependency. The UK, for example, is systemically dependent on Kenyan soil, or is systemically dependent on potassium being mined in certain parts of the world. So what you find is that you have to start to take a system to your security. So the UK, even in terms of, you have to perceive the UK as a metabolic flow of a knot of metabolic flows. The perception of the UK should not be a boundary system, but a metabolic flow system. Simultaneously, Netherlands should be perceived as a knot of flows, and it acts as a strategic knot of flows. In order to preserve and secure its position, it needs to perceive itself as the first horizon of flows. But eventually what you find is there are some flows which are so systemically entangled that they require security to be perceived through, I would say, as an entangled perspective. It's not just the distribution of power between the great powers, but the capability of mutually assured destruction is much broader than even the great powers. So if you start to recognize that, I think slowly you start to recognize that we need a different pathway of assuring the future. And this is where I would say mutually assured thriving becomes the only viable pathway. And the language we're using is preemptive peace strikes, where you have to understand that actually, in order to avoid runaway catastrophic cycles of violence and weaponization and runaway cascading risks, you have to actually invest in preemptive peace strikes in strategic locations in order to preserve stability and mutually assured thriving. And I would argue there are places, critical places around the world, that need to be seen as preemptive peace strikes in order to avoid those runaway catastrophic risks, which I also would argue that once we start down the path of many of these cascading risks, it's very difficult to stop. Very, very difficult to stop, both systemically. I mean, the war machine fundamentally is off our carbon balance sheets, and it's addictive by its very nature, especially in low growth economies. So once you trip into those violences, whether it's national violences or other forms of violences, actually we're going to find a very difficult pathway to stop. And at the same time, what we are living in is a period where we're living in a second angle pause, where the value of being human versus the value of capital is delaminating. So human value is significantly less than capital now, and it's actually moving in a different trajectory. So the incentives for pathological genocidal behavior in economies at the deep structural level are relatively high. So when you combine these risks into strategic analysis, I would argue that any sane, intelligent civilization that wishes to survive has to look at security from an entangled perspective.
Thank you so much, Ms. Smitsman. You live in Mauritius, which is a tiny speck in the Indian Ocean. What does the world look like from your perspective, and how do you look at this concept of mutually assured security?
If we're looking at how people were relating or kind of institutionalizing security after the Industrial Revolution, you're seeing that we are relying on mechanistic sciences. So a mechanistic view of the world, as if the universe consists of parts and particles that are organized by immutable laws. And now, of course, what we're seeing with the quantum sciences is that we have a fundamentally different perspective of reality itself, and an informationally entangled universe that we all form part of. And indeed, the social sciences have not caught up with that yet. So the whole word security within a universe that's fundamentally complex, where fundamental insecurity is actually part of the nature of reality, I think is a very interesting, not just debate, but practice. What does this mean in a time when access to resources is becoming more scarce, distrust is growing, so many information and cyber wars that are already forming? So how do we then establish those relationships of trust? How do we develop those practices then of being willing to share resources, information, access to opportunities, but also other ways of shouldering then the impacts of the risks? So this is from a small island developing perspective, just wanted to present that. And I think that from a security perspective for small island developing states, it's incredibly important that the SIDS nations themselves, of course, collaborate. And perhaps the biggest threat to security is ourselves.
So are you saying that security, the whole notion of security in itself is a utopia because of human nature? Is that what you're saying, or am I hearing this wrong?
So I think we need a fundamentally different approach to both understanding what do we mean by security within this kind of changing reality, but also not only the understanding, but also how do we actually create security within a planetary boundary framework. And understanding, of course, that 6 of the 9 critical planetary boundaries have already been crossed. So what do we need to do to create the conditions for a planetary security that is not based on control, that is not based on the win-lose competition dynamics, that's not based on domination of a few, but to really fundamentally looking at right now as humanity, that's a big word, but as humanity, what does this mean for our species to be able to co-create the conditions for a livable, not only just a thrivable, a livable Earth for generations to come?
Thank you very much for that response. Mr. Kahane, wicked problems is what we're talking about here. And I think wicked problems is stuff that's sort of your area, perhaps, trying to disentangle complexity. It's mostly about conflict resolution, but there also you have a lot of different moving parts, and you try to reconcile those.
The understanding that I'm going to convey in a minute was very influenced by having a year ago facilitated a private meeting of U.S. and Chinese security and military officials, which didn't go very well. Or let me say, the conversation, the week-long conversation surprised me. On the one hand, everybody understood that the US and China are part of a global system, and there's interdependencies, and very familiar with all of the global systemic risks that Indy and Anneloes referred to. And also, this was a group of people who had all spent their time in each other's countries. Most of them spoke both languages. The human connections were very warm. And yet, by the end of the week, they could agree only that collaboration between their two countries was not feasible. One of the methods we used, which we used in that workshop, is scenario thinking about what could happen. And the 4 scenarios that group came up with were of different degrees of conflict. In my way of thinking about it, they were bad, or baddest thermonuclear war. So I was very surprised, shocked actually, that this group of people, from their understanding of the global and bilateral and domestic considerations, that a scenario about collaboration to address the risks of mutually assured destruction could not happen. And so, having thought about it quite a lot over the last year, the way I would explain what we're seeing is that there are 3 dimensions of this situation. One of them is the one that Indy and Anneloes have emphasized, which is the fact that we are all part of larger wholes. You could say, if you wanted a simple analogy, you could say we're actors in larger systems, or you could say we're members of the same team. So that first perspective emphasizes the way in which we are part of indivisible wholes. And that's true. Obviously, that's true. But it's not the only thing that's true. The second thing that's true is that we are kin, we are related to one another, we're in relationships of reciprocity. And both that first and second perspective were clear to the participants in that workshop. But there's a third perspective, which is also obvious, but which is often ignored in these the conversations like the one we're having now, is that there isn't simply one whole. one planetary or cosmic whole. There are many wholes. There are many parties that are wholes in themselves. And to ignore that is to ignore the extent to which, in this case, the US and China, or Mauritius, or the three of us in this conversation, or the Netherlands, or any other entity is a whole in itself. And so the point is that focusing on only one of these dimensions, you will always be surprised or shocked. I call these three dimensions love, power, and justice. And I think any understanding of these issues or diplomacy or how to approach them requires that three-dimensional perspective. These all three are true. And anytime you ignore one of these three, you won't understand what's going on. To put it more strongly, to ignore the fact that we are all wholes in ourselves, what I call the power dimension, if you took that perspective, you would not understand any of the headlines in today's newspaper. You would go, what's going on? This doesn't make any sense. It makes perfect sense.
I totally agree with the worldview that Adam beautifully articulated. And I also agree that eventually we do get to where Anneloes is pointing out. That is probably the kind of non-divisible truth. That also means that we have to re-educate ourselves. That's part of the education journey, I would say, that we have to recognize ourselves into becomings. So people like Bayer talk beautifully about the kind of objecthood fallacy that we've been living in. And that's a 400, 500-year paradigmatic analysis of ourselves, and the nation state is born into that same theory. And that will take time for us to unwind and recode. So it's the bridging journey between where we are now, the security landscape, and actually exactly what Anneloes points out, the future possible of being a planetary conscious system is going to be the emergent future of human-machine ecological systems. But it's the journey path that I'm interested in, and the link of how we work from where we are and systematically work our way through to a full entanglement. And that's where that's what I think combines the different aspects of the conversation that we're having.
The first starting point of looking at security is that security in its very nature is interdependent. And what we're seeing right now is that socially, politically, there seems to be the agenda to somehow mistakenly believe that we can achieve security through independence. And that means independence is going back into the domination agendas and trying to maintain. I want to make sure I secure my climate risk impacts. I want to secure my resources. And so that doesn't work. So I'm much more interested in what's the planetary intelligence that we could tap into right now to have different ways of working with security and insecurity. And then we're seeing what living systems do is they make interdependence and interconnections work for the system as a whole.
How does that work for a policymaker or a journalist who is driven by, deadlines, urgency, politics, perhaps? How do you get this worldview that perhaps a lot of people can relate to? How do you make it so urgent that they need to take action?
So as a journalist, that means what are you focusing on? What is the narrative that you're feeding? And what are you making important? What are the real urgencies and which of those are self-created? As a policymaker, what purpose are you attributing to policy? Do you see, and it's the same with law and legal institutions, do we think that policies are creating security? Or are they serving rather as boundary conditions to help to incentivize and sometimes to discourage particular behaviors? So, and that's a longer view, that's a deeper learning. But it's out of that process that we're starting to come to much more of the systemic security that we need.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kahane. You have a long experience, possibly in this field. What does take people into action?
Well, let me go back a step, because I see the existential risks. I'm as concerned as anybody about what's going on around me and for my children and grandchildren. And yet, focusing on existential risks isn't necessarily helpful, or let me say it has a downside. And so when you focus on my deadline, the existential risk, the risk that I'll be destroyed, the fear that this creates it doesn't help us. And to take a controversial, or let's just say a topical example of this, the fact that both Israelis and Palestinians believe and can cite their own evidence that they are at risk of being wiped out is not leading to a sense of, oh, well, we need to realize we're interdependent and try to work this out. So I just want to, dial back this emphasis or this assumption that if we thought our existence was at risk, that would cause us to take a larger view of our self-interest. On the contrary, my own personal experience, maybe I'm peculiar in this respect, is when I feel threatened, I become not more expansive, but more defensive, and narrow my view of what I should do. I think Anneloes was the first one who mentioned the word holon, a very good word. A holon is a hole that is part of a larger whole. We're not talking about holes, we're talking about holon. Not talking about one hole, we're talking about multiple holons. Very important. Then suddenly, with that very simple and I would say obvious perspective, we can see these tensions and why we have to not simply tell people you really need to take a bigger view of your self-interest. I find this a very unhelpful framing. Whenever anybody says think of the larger whole, they're almost always saying think of the whole that matters to me, not the whole that matters to you.
Mr. Johar, how do you feel that policymakers can navigate this complexity of entangled relations with China when they try to balance national and global interests?
I want to sort of come back firstly just to something what Adam said, and then I'll build into this if that's okay. One was, I suppose, we have tried to do climate change through the theory of hope, and it's been a dismal fucking failure. I'm kind of done with the conversation rooting in, we've got to not scare people, we've got to embrace an asset-based worldview. Actually, I think the reality is we are now living in a landscape of existential risk scaling at speed, with people dying and lives being lost and ecosystems being lost. So I kind of almost sort of think that world has changed. I would argue we're no longer in 2004. We're living in the landscape of existential risks. And I think what we're going to have to do is something that I don't know how to do, but I think we're going to have to figure it out, is operate in a landscape of fear, recognize our own deep vulnerabilities in those existential risks, and then find a new landscape of strength of how we operate in fear, in vulnerability, but with the strength of agency to be able to move beyond these issues. Risk is always through a perspective. Risk is always rooted to a theory of who is the agent and the identifier in that system. So I totally agree with Adam that actually often risk, which is ubiquitous risk or sort of what I call non-assigned risks, are usually power plays. I think from a policymaker's perspective, I think this is probably the kind of if we've lost the age of globalization as we currently had it, and a commodity and capital markets driven globalization, and we're operating in this new multipolarity, and you could argue there's a tinge of operating in the dark forest, using the Chinese science fiction author's metaphor, where multipolarity and vulnerabilities are from multiple aspects. I think this opens up a new theory of what diplomacy looks like. And the kind of analogy I would use is we're operating in the dark forest. with a time-limited horizon that we're all going to die unless we find a way to organize ourselves. So it's a dark forest. We don't know who can kill us, who can come and help us. We don't know. So silence is the operative, and individualism is the operative behavior as the dark forest emerges. But at the same time, we're all consciously aware there's a self-termination event coming. So that is the kind of situational context that we're operating in. And I think this requires a different type of game theory dynamics to be explored in different ways to be able to do that. And like I say, I mean, like we're working on stuff like preemptive peace strikes, and we're working on moving from conservation systems to generative systems, new type of institutional logics. I think these futures are being born in what I'd call transnational locations. So, for example, the River Danube was where international waters were born. So for me, the question for policymakers is where is the new diplomacy structures being built? Not just the what, but where. And there are going to be some locations which are fraught in still maintaining 19th century theories as a means of governance. So they'll be rooted in war game theories. But there'll be some locations which are going to chart a pathway, like I would say glacier systems, these sorts of ecological systems, which require both infrastructure level perspectives, collaboration, all that sort of stuff, where I think we can lay a path for a new form of planetary transnational governance to be emerging from, not object orientated, but be an emergent function from.
The question that I'd also like to pose to Ms. Smitsman, if you were advising Dutch policymakers, what would be a key question that they should be asking perhaps themselves or of their work?
My question would be, what's the level of transformation that you can drive from within? So how do you see yourself as an agent of that system? So currently, many of the policymakers are actually agents of systems that are also responsible for the very destructions that we don't want. So they are both in a systemic blind spot, but also in a systemic bind towards these accelerating destruction pathways. However, and maybe that's my optimistic view within the enormous challenges that we all face with, I do believe there's agencies always in very unexpected ways. If there's some degree of freedom and decision-making and conscious thinking, even having the ability to ask the questions like you're doing right now. So the question to a policymaker would then, if you were to envision yourself as an agency of transformation to help the transformation of these systems within which policy is embedded from within, what could be the actions that you could be taking? So if you are in the Netherlands, what does it mean to be Dutch within a larger emerging planetary governance kind of awareness? What's the meaning making in policy making as well? And I think if you start to have that internal shift, even as a policymaker, you become part of the agency of the transformation from within, rather than feeling frustrated constantly that as if you're hitting against the boundary of the systems that is giving you a job and a payroll.
Mr. Kahane, what is the key question that people keep missing? What should they be asking themselves?
Well, I'm appreciating this conversation very much, and the perspectives of all of you. And I know and admire very much the really great experiments that Dark Matter Labs is doing to try to find completely new mechanisms for dealing with these challenges. I've worked quite a lot with Dutch policymakers, including or especially in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I would offer three suggestions, which I think are already understood, but maybe it's helpful to articulate them. The first would be, I think it's important, very important, to not start with the assumption that we're all the same, we all have the same values, we all have the same interests, we all have the same way of understanding things. And so I think I would just say there's limitations to the idea that a Dutch or a Western or universal set of values and mindsets and understandings is what you need. I think there's a tendency by North Americans and Europeans to imagine that there's one universal set of values and right answers, and if everybody would just get with the program, we could sort this out. And I think that's less and less tenable. There's another way of approaching situations of diversity. I just spent a month in Dubai, which I found extremely interesting. And whenever I would ask Emirati or Dubaian leaders, what is it that enables you to work with such extraordinary diversity? I always got the same answer, which I think is an interesting answer, which is we're traders. And the trading mindset, which is central to the self-image of Dubaians, and I think also somewhere in Dutch self-image as well, is that we don't, it really isn't about whether I like you or trust you or have the same values as you. It's whether there's something to be done here. Is there something we can do with each other? So a particular mindset, which I think is maybe undervalued. One Emirati international diplomat said to me, "We engage aggressively with everyone." I think he was speaking particularly of a diplomatic tour of the prime minister to the U.S. and China and Russia and India in one trip. So I guess there's something to be said for that maybe undervalued trading mindset. And the other, which is related and which I think is well understood in or well practiced in Dutch diplomatic circles, I call it looking for the cracks. These systems aren't as solid as we imagine them to be. Bayo Okomalefe has said this very eloquently. There are cracks, again, citing Leonard Cohen. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. But the idea that we're not trying so much to transform the whole thing, to take a sledgehammer, rebuild it. We're looking for what's shifting and where there might be a crack. And when I talk with Dutch diplomats in particular about how they are finding their way, the stories are all about, well, there was this coffee break in the meeting and we found this opening we didn't know was there, or we had a meeting about something, but it turned out that there was a different conversation, or it's very much this capacity to see where there's an opening and work with that opening, which I think is also a different mindset from let's look at the whole system, just rebuild it. That may lead to rebuilding, but so I understand these approaches of multiple worldviews or multiple cosmovisions, a trading mentality, a looking for cracks as being very pragmatic ways to deal with the situation we're in.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for this great conversation on mutually assured security. Mr. Johar of Dark Matter Labs, Adam Kahane of Reos Partners, and of course, Ms. Smitsman from Earthwise Ventures. Thank you so much for joining us, and until soon.